Happy Wednesday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Now, before we move on to the main story, we note a tragic development. A powerful 7.1 magnitude earthquake struck Tibet near Mount Everest on Tuesday morning, local time, killing at least 126 people and injuring almost 200. Over 3,000 buildings were destroyed, leaving thousands homeless as temperatures plunged to negative 16 degrees Celsius, 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Rescue operations continued through the night, with workers navigating debris and distributing blankets in the hardest hit areas. The quake, one of China's deadliest in recent years, also disrupted power and water supplies, with over 40 aftershocks recorded. Survivors described extensive destruction to dirt-constructed homes, while others recalled the terror of being jolted awake by violent tremors. Beijing has deployed drones and Air Force units to aid recovery. The Dalai Lama offered prayers for the victims, while neighbouring Nepal, which felt the tremors, reported no major casualties. Okay, now let's move to the main story for today. This week, US-based The Wire China, founded by veteran journalist David Barboza, who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, both for China-related stories, published an excellent interview with Barry Naughton. Naughton, the So-Kwan-Lok Chair of Chinese International Affairs at UC San Diego, is one of the world's leading experts on China's economy and its transformation over the last half-century. In the interview, Naughton discusses the state of the economy generally and the implications of Xi Jinping's vision for it specifically. He paints a very pessimistic picture, potentially the end of China as we have known it. The interview is long and well worth reading in full. I've added a link to the interview in the description below. For today's video, I wanted to move away from the regular format and examine some of this interview and a few of Naughton's more salient answers. So we will quote selected excerpts, lightly edited, from the piece directly. Question. There's been plenty of criticism of Beijing's economic policy in recent years, and alarm about whether China is entering a period of so-called Japanification, where it experiences years of sluggish growth. How do you think we should characterize the Xi Jinping economy right now? Answer. I think we can characterize his approach as this: billions for tech, but not 1 cent for bailouts. This captures 2 elements of what Xi Jinping wants. The first is high tech and secure development, or what Xi would call high quality growth. And the other is that he's very adverse to bailing out failing businesses or failing local governments, even when they could potentially be put back on their feet with a bit of a financing helping hand. Xi Jinping doesn't really care about what Chinese people want to buy or want to make, because that would just be ordinary GDP. He's asserting that there's something more fundamental than that, high-quality GDP, which is determined, at the end of the day, by Xi Jinping himself. That's a very strong, deeply rooted tendency of his, and it's really very similar to the impulses that drives a planned economy. Xi Jinping is making a gamble that all these technologies the state is pouring capital into will at some point come together and produce a sudden surge of productivity. And he might be right. We can't say for sure that he's not, but thus far, he's very much not. Question. Do you see it as realistic that China will become self-reliant in chips in the way that Xi might also want? Answer. No, not in a reasonable, foreseeable time frame, 5 to 10 years, but China is making major investments in each link of the entire semiconductor industrial chain, and they're making progress. Of course, in a decade, the semiconductor industry will have moved on. I don't think anybody could say that this has been a successful industrial policy so far, and it's been very costly. Question. To turn to the second half of your formulation, no bailouts. How has that manifested itself in the last 2 or 3 years? Answer. Of course, anti-corruption is a linchpin of Xi Jinping's consolidation of power. He wants a more disciplined society. That's a big part of his fundamental worldview. And so when it comes to look at how to resolve an economic situation like the housing bust or the crisis in local government finance, he's very adverse to the idea of you're going to reward anyone who failed to manage their local jurisdiction effectively or who made reckless investments. He just does not want to bail out any of these people because it would create a bad precedent. This also means that none of the things that we've seen to prop up demand and keep institutional structures intact have yet involved a substantial resolution of large amounts of debt. He keeps refinancing, kicking the can down the road, injecting some funds into the system to keep everybody from falling, but without resolving any of the problems. That's really a problem, because at a certain point you have to clean up the mess. You mentioned earlier whether China was becoming Japan-like. This is one respect in which it certainly is. Japan spent almost a decade trying to painlessly restructure a financial system that had suffered a huge reduction in the value of its assets. It was the fundamental problem that lay behind the so-called lost decade in Japan. And now China seems to be repeating some parts of that. Question. Any attempt to fully restore the financial system to health is going to imply recognizing and apportioning losses, though, right? Answer. I like the way you put it. It's a question, in financial slang, of deciding who gets a haircut and how much, and China hasn't done that. The only thing they've done is to try to say, no haircuts for people who prepaid for their housing units, we should try to guarantee delivery for them. That's a politically good idea, but it's also a politically easy policy. What is much harder is deciding who gets forced into bankruptcy, who gets bailed out, and who pays what costs in that process. The best practice is to force some of the early, worst-case, bad actors into bankruptcy. But then, in order to restore confidence, provide financial support to the better firms. China had the chance to do this with collapsed real estate developer Evergrande, but it never did put it decisively into bankruptcy, and instead just let it bleed to death. Question. Do you see unemployment being a structural problem for China? Is the Xi Jinping economy going to provide enough jobs for the Chinese people to do in the future? Answer. China seems to be rushing so fast into so many of these new technologies without really worrying about what their impact on employment will be. That, it seems, at the minimum, to be reckless. There's two different labour markets too. There's the market for newly minted college graduates, who compose a whole spectrum of skills levels, but which certainly include very highly skilled and very bright, capable young people. And there's a whole other labour market of mostly migrant workers. Both these markets are in crisis. The data that China releases are basically all about the first one, the urban, relatively high-skilled market. But the migrant market also seems to be in some kind of crisis. Millions of migrants have probably returned home and don't have very much to do. I think these twin labour market problems are serious and long-term, and it's hard to see what they're doing to deal with them. Question. Why doesn't China introduce a more progressive tax system to redistribute wealth somewhat, and also improve the welfare system? Answer. That's a great question, and to be honest, I don't know. They have backed themselves into a corner. Their primary constituency is really a couple of 100 million urban people. They care a lot about what those people think, and not so much about rural people and migrants. They seem to be committed to protecting the full value of the pensions and healthcare benefits for all the urban residents, and not subjecting them to additional taxation. As a quick aside, if this statement is an accurate characterization, it is deeply and bitterly ironic for a nominally communist party. We continue with the quote. Here's this government that in many ways is not at all responsive to public opinion, but on 4 or 5 crucial economic issues that impact state workers, government employees, and urban full-time employees of other kinds, they are very, very cautious. Here ends the direct quote. Now, before we examine his concluding statements, I wanted to take a brief detour and examine an observation from Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis, who we quote often on China Update, who discussed this Naughton piece in a long post yesterday. But just quickly, if you're getting some value from today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. If you want to be on top of major developments in China as they happen, maybe consider subscribing. And for those who want to go the extra mile and help me keep China Update financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Now we move to the Pettis observation from yesterday. It's a long quote, but it is worth giving him the space to unpack his points. This is what he said in response to this interview this week. Quote, Naughton says that Japan spent almost a decade trying to painlessly restructure a financial system that had suffered a huge reduction in the value of its assets. And now China seems to be repeating some parts of that. Naughton is right, and on an issue that is widely misunderstood. The huge surge in China's debt burden has been an enormous problem, but not because the debt itself is the problem. It is just the symptom of the problem. In itself, debt is simply a set of transfers, an explicit transfer today followed by an explicit or implicit transfer tomorrow. In China's case, most of the accumulated debt had been used to fund investment. But if this investment had been productive, then by definition, the increase in debt would have been more than matched over the medium term by an increase in GDP. The fact that China's debt burden has surged in the past 15 years is pretty conclusive evidence that the investment in the aggregate has not been productive. That's the problem. The cost of creating these investment assets was much greater than the value these assets generated for the economy. In an economy governed by hard budget constraints, the losses would have been expensed, and so would not have added to overall GDP. In China's case, however, the growing tendency of the economy to shift to areas that did not operate under hard budget constraints meant that those losses could be capitalized rather than expensed, in which case they boosted GDP growth and created fictitious wealth. As long as the associated debt servicing costs could be rolled over, the economy could continue capitalizing these losses and adding fictitiously to GDP. But because no one has infinite debt capacity, eventually those fictitious losses have to be recognized. What is much more difficult, the losses also have to be implicitly or explicitly allocated within the economy. This creates three separate problems. First, the GDP that was created by capitalizing rather than expensing losses must be reversed. Secondly, the creation of fictitious wealth at first boosts economic activity through a wealth effect, but as it is written down, it dampens economic activity even more vigorously through a negative wealth effect. We saw this with real estate in China. As prices soared to well above any economically justified value, Chinese households celebrated the amazing increase in their wealth by consuming more than they otherwise would have. The reverse has been true since 2021. The third problem may be the most important and least understood. This is the problem that corporate finance specialists refer to as financial distress costs, or the adverse economic impact of the uncertainty associated with the allocation of losses. The losses are ultimately shared out between all stakeholders, but the way in which they are shared out is very uneven and often very politicized. As a result, stakeholders must alter their behavior in ways that protect them and limit their exposure to the allocation of these losses. The way they alter their behavior, businesses cut back on investment, workers become more militant or more sluggish, the rich engage in capital flight, policymakers shorten their time horizons, etc., always causes growth to decline more than it otherwise would have. It is because of these financial distress costs that financial crises, which assigns the losses more quickly through balance sheet collapses, tend to be less painful economically in the long run, even if they are more painful socially and politically in the short run. This, as I see it, was Japan's main problem. By the late 1980s, it had enormous amounts of capitalized losses on collective balance sheets, and these were resolved and allocated very slowly over a period during which Japan's share of global GDP dropped from 17% to 6%. This, as I see it, was Japan's main problem. By the late 1980s, it had enormous amounts of capitalized losses on collective balance sheets, and these were resolved and allocated very slowly over a period during which Japan's share of global GDP dropped from 17% to 6%. End quote. Now let's return to Naughton's interview. Question: when you look back over your career, do you feel depressed about the way things have played out? Answer: of course, I feel sad that one of the things I devoted my career to was trying to explain to Americans why what was happening in China was important and positive, and more potentially beneficial than a lot of people realized. I was very disappointed at two things. One was the very gradual change in Chinese policy after about 2006. It's a fundamental challenge to our understanding not just of China, but of the world. China, the country that benefited the most from globalization, chose to turn against it and to say, oh, that was okay, but we can do much better. That was ultimately very destabilizing for the entire world. The second thing is that China then abandoned the peaceful rise policy that it had in the first part of the century and adopted a set of policies to play a greater role on the global stage, while essentially eroding the basis of the American system and pre-positioning themselves to be in some kind of alternative leadership position. So I feel quite surprised and sad. But it is what it is. Here ends the direct quote of the interview and today's episode of China Update. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching. Please let me know in the comments below what you thought of some of the observations made in the interview, as well as Pettis' edition. Thank you, everybody, for watching today's episode of China Update. Have a good Wednesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.